A bundle of grey stalks leans against the wall by the fire. To a modern eye, it looks like nothing. Kindling, maybe. Yard waste at best. But to the family in that cottage, those stalks were a bank account, a winter coat, and a warm night, all in one. And when the cold came, they burned them. Burning hemp, though, did not mean what you are probably picturing. There was no high in it, no haze to chase. The plant a medieval peasant grew was bred for rope, not for the head, and it would sooner hand you a headache than a dream. What burning it actually did was keep a family from freezing. But the road that Stalk took to reach the fire ran through rotting water so foul that kings would one day make it a crime. This was the most useful plant in medieval Europe. It rigged the ships. It clothed the poor. And for a stretch of history, you were ordered by law to grow it. Tonight we follow one hemp plant from a peasant's field all the way to the flames. The growing, the rotting, the breaking, and finally the burning. And we find out why the one crop a kingdom could not put to sea without is the same one a shopper today cannot legally carry home. Before the fire, a quick question for the comments. Could you turn a weed in a field into the shirt on your back? Most of us could not name a single step. A medieval child could name all of them. It was the year 1533, and in England the growing of this plant had just stopped being a choice. King Henry VIII put it in writing. For every 60 acres of farmland a man worked, he was required to sow a quarter acre with hemp or flax. Ignore the order, and the fine was 3 shillings and 4 pence. That was close to half a year's wage for a household servant. The Crown was not doing this for medicine, and it was certainly not doing it for pleasure. It was doing it for rope. A single warship swallowed rope by the mile, the rigging that held the masts, the heavy cables that dropped the anchor, the nets, the lashings, and the sailcloth stretched across the yards. Almost all of it came from hemp, and a large ship could carry tens of tons of the stuff before it ever left harbour. A navy without hemp was a navy that stayed at the dock. The word we still use for that heavy cloth tells the whole story. Canvas comes straight from the Latin word for hemp, cannabis, carried into English through Old French. When a sailor spread canvas to catch the wind, he was, quite literally, spreading the hemp plant across the sky. And it did not stop at the shore. Fishermen knotted hemp into nets. Farmers bound their loads and their beasts with hemp cord. Millers moved sacks of grain in hemp sacking. The poorest households spun the rougher fibre into a coarse, scratchy cloth and wore it until it fell apart on their backs. Hemp was the thread that held the medieval world together, and almost none of the people wearing it or sailing under it ever thought of it as anything but ordinary work, and the quality of it mattered in ways we have forgotten. A frayed anchor cable in a storm could drown an entire crew. A rope that held was the difference between a ship that came home and one that did not, which is exactly why the Crown cared so much about who grew hemp and how well they grew it. On land it was humbler, but no less constant. Hemp twine mended, tied, trapped and bound nearly everything a household touched, from the thatch over their heads to the traces on the plough. That is the part worth holding on to. The plant a modern government treats as contraband was once so essential that a king would fine you for failing to plant enough of it. So how did a green stalk in a field become a shirt, or a sail, or the tinder in a winter hearth? The answer begins with a crop grown to be strangely, deliberately tall. A hemp field did not look like a field of wheat. It grew as a dense green thicket of thin stalks, packed shoulder to shoulder and shooting straight up, some of them taller than the man who planted them. That crowding was the whole trick. Grown tight against each other, the plants could not spread sideways into branches, so they raced upward for the light instead. What the peasant wanted was length. The longer and straighter the stalk, the longer the fibre hidden inside it, and the more of it he could sell or spin. Harvest came in the late summer, and it was not cut with a scythe. The plants were pulled up whole by hand, roots and all, so that the fibres ran unbroken from the top of the stalk to the bottom. It was hot, filthy, back-bending work that stained the hands green and left a fine dust clinging to sweat all the way up the arms. A family would spend days bent over the rows, then lay the pulled stalks out in bundles to dry under the sun. There was more than one pass through the field too. The plants did not all ripen at the same moment, and a careful grower took the crop in stages so that nothing was pulled too green or left standing too long. Every stage was hand labour. No machines, no shortcuts, only rows of bent backs working against the turning of the season. A single family's plot could take the better part of a week to clear, and that was before one single fibre had been freed from one single stalk. But a dry hemp stalk on its own is useless. The part everyone wanted, that soft grey fibre, was bound to a hard woody core down the centre of the plant, glued there by nature so tightly that no amount of pulling or scraping would tear it loose. To free the fibre, the glue had to be destroyed, and the only way medieval people knew to destroy it was to let the plant begin, in a careful and controlled way, to rot. This seemed like a small dirty chore in the middle of a long harvest. It was not. It was about to turn the village water into something close to poison. The process was called retting, and it was rotting held on a knife edge. The bundles of hemp were weighed down and left to soak, sometimes in a stagnant pond, sometimes in a slow stream, sometimes in a pit dug for the purpose alone. Bacteria in the water went to work on the plant, feeding on the pectin that bound the fibre to the core. Time it right over a week or two, and the fibres slipped free, clean and strong. Time it wrong, and the batch either stayed glued and worthless, or rotted straight through and fell apart in the hands. There was a gentler way to do it, called dew retting, where the stalks were spread across a grassy field and left for weeks to be rotted slowly by the dew and the damp. It was safer, and it stank far less, but it was slow, and it left the fibre darker and weaker than the alternative. Again and again, peasants chose the faster, filthier road instead. They soaked their hemp in standing water, and they paid for it with the pond. This is the detail the tidy histories skip. That retting water became foul beyond description. As the plants broke down, the water turned dark and greasy, stinking of decay, and the feeding bacteria stripped the oxygen out of the pond until nothing could live in it. Fish in a retting pond died and floated. The stench rolled across a whole village for days. And if that water was the same pond your animals drank from, or your neighbours did, you had just poisoned the parish supply. People noticed, and this was no vague folk grumble. It ended up written into the law of the land. Acts of Parliament under the Tudor kings made it illegal to ret hemp or flax in any running stream or river where cattle came to drink. You could rot your hemp only in still, closed ground or in dedicated pits, kept well away from the water people and beasts relied on. Sit with what that means. The same crown that forced its peasants to grow hemp also had to pass a law forbidding them from soaking it in the village water. That is how vile this one step was, and the twist turns out to be almost too neat. The plant that dressed a whole kingdom also had to be hidden from that kingdom's own drinking water, and somehow it gets worse for the peasant because the stinking pond was only the halfway mark. Almost none of this knowledge is truly lost. People have pieced these old skills back together, and they are pulling, retting, and spinning hemp again today. If that makes you want to put your own hands on the past instead of only watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the dishes themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for keeping a living leaven the old way, and the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find real heritage grain. The bread is where that kitchen begins. So here is where the hemp finally starts moving toward the fire, and it does so under a hammer. Once the retted stalks were dried a second time, bone dry and brittle, they were ready to be broken. The tool was often a wooden brake, a long hinged jaw of timber that the worker slammed down again and again onto the stalks laid across it. Each blow snapped the woody core inside into short, hard splinters, while the tough outer fibre, springy and strong, refused to break. It was loud, jarring, dusty work, and it went on for hours over every armful of stalk. This was winter work, done indoors by firelight once the fields were bare and there was little else to do. It filled the air with a fine, choking dust that caught in the throat and settled over everything in the room. Whole households worked at it together through the long, dark evenings, breaking and scraping and combing, turning a barn full of dried stalk into a basket of clean fibre, one slow handful at a time. Snapping the core was only the opening move. After breaking came scutching, scraping the battered stalks with a wooden blade to knock the loosened splinters away. After scutching came heckling, dragging the fibre through beds of iron spikes like a savage comb, tearing out the last fragments and combing the strands into long, clean, shining hanks ready for the spindle. That fibre was the treasure. It became the rope, the sail, the cloth, and the coin. But every one of those violent steps threw off a byproduct. As the core shattered and rained down, it gathered on the floor in a growing heap of dry, woody fragments. Those fragments had a name. They were called herds, or shivs, and to a modern factory they are still just the leftovers, the waste swept up after the valuable fibre has been carried off. To a medieval household, that heap on the floor was nothing of the sort. That heap was the answer to the question in the title. That heap was what you burned. And this is where the whole story finally turns, because the lowlier scrap of the plant, the garbage nobody bothered to name kindly, quietly did one of the most vital jobs in the house. The woody core of hemp is close cousin to ordinary wood in what it is actually made of. When it dries, it behaves like wood that has been shattered into 1,000 thin, brittle slivers. That happens to be very close to a perfect fuel. Small, bone dry, and full of sharp edges, herds catch a spark faster than any log and flare up hot the very instant they meet a flame. In a world where making fire meant striking flint against steel and nursing a single faint ember into life, that speed was worth more than almost anything a family owned. A pile of hemp herds was the finest tinder and kindling a poor cottage had. A pinch of it took the spark when nothing damp around it would. A handful of it grew that spark into a working flame, and a basketful of it fed the morning fire in fast, cheap bursts of heat, the kindling that woke the slow, stubborn logs every single day before dawn. It cost nothing. It was already lying on the floor. It was the difference between a cold, dark hearth and a warm pot of porridge, pulled for free from the bones of a crop grown for something else entirely. There was even a craft to the burning itself. Herds flared fast and died fast, so they were fed to the fire in small handfuls rather than dumped in all at once, coaxing the flame upward until the slower, heavier wood caught and held. At night the glowing remains were raked together and buried under their own ash, and the same hearth kept its heat until morning, ready to be woken again with another pinch of the very same hemp. The plant that had already become rope and cloth was now in its final form both the match that started the fire and the fuel that carried it. So what actually happens when you burn hemp the way a medieval peasant did? You get a quick, hot, crackling little fire. You get your food cooked and your hands thawed, and your one room lit against the dark. And you get, at the very end of a long and stinking process, the last drop of worth squeezed out of a plant that had already handed you rope and cloth and seed. That is the honest answer, not a trance. A warm kitchen. Now, burning hemp for its smoke is a genuine chapter of history. It is simply far older and far stranger than a peasant's cottage. The Greek writer Herodotus, around 440 BC, described the Scythians, a horse people of the open steppe, throwing hemp seed onto red-hot stones inside a sealed tent and howling with delight as the fumes rose around them. That is real, ancient, and deliberate. But it belongs to a wild plant grown for its resin, not to the tall rope-grade hemp a European peasant hauled out of a muddy field. Burn armfuls of that in a tent, and you would win yourself a coughing fit and an aching head, and precious little else. Which is the quiet irony sitting under this whole story. The plant modern law fears the most is not really the plant that warmed medieval Europe at all. The peasant crouched over that fire was not chasing a feeling. He was chasing survival, and he was far too poor to let a single fibre of anything go to waste. Because that is the thread running through all of it, from the pulled stalk to the ash in the grate. Nothing left that plant unused. The long fibre became rope strong enough to hold a warship against the tide. The rougher fibre became the shirt on a labourer's back. The seed fed people and animals and was crushed for its oil. And the woody core, the part that fell to the floor and got kicked aside, became the tinder that lit the room. One plant, pulled from one wet field, clothed you, rigged the fleet, fed you, and warmed you through the winter. That is what has truly been lost, and it is not the plant which still grows as easily as it ever did. What vanished is the knowledge of how to draw an entire life out of it, and the patience to pull it, rot it, break it, comb it, and finally feed even its splinters to the flames. A medieval family carried every one of those steps in their hands and their memory. We carry almost none of it, and we have learned instead to call the plant a problem. It is a strange thing to outlaw a plant that once built your civilization. The hemp itself never changed. Only we did, trading the hard, patient knowledge of how to use every last part of it for the comfort of never having to. So the next time you hear the word canvas, remember exactly where it comes from. Remember that a king once fined men for refusing to grow it. Remember that a village would foul its own pond to process it, and that when there was nothing left of the plant but dry splinters, a cold family fed even those to the fire without a thought. The grey stalk leaning by the hearth was never nothing at all. It was very nearly everything. We dig up skills the modern world forgot. What surprised you most? The law, the poison pond, or the burning? Tell me below and subscribe.